Are you straight edge with a head so bold you're banned from being close to airports due to a fear of light bouncing off that bold head into the eyes of pilots? Do you have multiple piercings, green spiky hair, and essentially just look like a randomised custom character on a video game? Are you just generally extremely physically and mentally crusty? Well, it's likely you fit into one of the many subgenres of punk, but what you may not be aware of is there are a lot of very strange and overly specific subgenres of punk that are very much outside the appeal of the typical hardcore fan or crust punk. As you're probably already aware, punk is responsible for this, and unfortunately this, as well as the vast majority of rock music created after everybody suddenly started thinking that dressing like this is acceptable. In turn, this must result in a spiderweb of weird and wacky subgenres that splinter off directly from punk. Some of the more normal ones include emo, which is essentially the down-badification of punk, and hardcore punk, which is the boldification of punk. I would mention pop punk as being one of the normal ones, however this kind of happened, so I'm just going to ignore that, tuck that away and hope no one discovers it. This video will explore the weirder side of punk subgenres, the ones that haven't resulted in thousands of insecure teenagers basing their entire personalities around them. Of course, we have to start with the subgenre with the silliest name. What kind of YouTuber would I be if I didn't? Let's get straight into cowpunk. The first thing that may come to mind when you hear cowpunk is probably this. However, regardless of its name, cowpunk has an extremely rich history and encompasses a range of diverse sounds. The term cowpunk refers to bands who fold elements of country, blues, folk and rockabilly into their punk sound, which results in music that can sound extremely different and oftentimes sounds more like some sort of malformed rebellious country than anything punk. Oftentimes cowpunk combines the sped up heavy riffing of punk with a twangy tone heard more from rockabilly guitars and more country instrumentation such as acoustic and pedal steel guitars. Cowpunk started off as a reaction against the conventions of country, yet still embodies a lot of the same traits. It is also somehow a rebellion against punk as well, because anything labelled as punk rebels against everything and anything including themselves. Born in the late 70s, cowpunk first reared its inbred head during the post-punk explosion, with bands introducing elements of more traditional country and folk music into their crusty sound. Of course, the early artists didn't call themselves cowpunk, because who the f would actually call themselves cowpunk? Of course, this term was coined by random pretentious music critics who probably thought they were incredibly funny. As the years yeehawed onwards, cowpunk would see some mainstream recognition, mainly in the 90s, because literally anything could become mainstream in the 90s. Prominent bands within this subgenre include Meat Puppets, Violent Femmes, and Country Teasers. Let's switch to a more recognisable but similarly acoustic subgenre of punk. Folk punk. This is another subgenre that sonically leaves a lot of punk's conventions behind, but still keeps the raw essence of punk, and I guess it's still kind of a subgenre of cowpunk or vice versa, but let's not overcomplicate something already needlessly overcomplicated. Folk punk takes the traditional instrumentation of folk music and combines it with the primal energy of punk, creating something that on paper sounds like the audio representation of this image, but really is more like this image. Unlike many of the subgenres on this list, there's a more defined list of proto-folk punk artists to dip our toes into. Artists like Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie were embracing a more rebellious side to folk, long before venues were being filled with sweat, hair gel and spiky silver jewellery. The first true folk punk song would be released in 1977 within Patrick Gerald's self-titled EP. The song Safety Pin Stuck in My Heart would combine punk rock imagery with acoustic guitars and vocals. This would be expanded on in the 80s with artists like the Violent Femmes, Husker Du and Dead Milkmen, adding more acoustic tracks and folksier songs onto their albums. The Pogues would continue this trend, sprinkling a little bit of poor dental hygiene into the mix. They would punkify already established folk songs, as well as producing their own folk punk to a surprising amount of success, achieving 3 top 10 albums in the UK. Folk punk would then branch into gypsy punk and Celtic punk. In the modern day, folk punk is a genre that remains prominent in the underground, producing some very low testosterone music. Prominent artists include AJJ, Harley Poe and Croc. Although these genres can be pretty scary at times, this isn't intentional. Horror punk, however, fits that mold perfectly. Essentially, they combine creepypastas, top 10 goblin sighting videos, and calling Henry Rollins at 3 AM videos, with the raw energy and aggression of punk rock. It includes aggressive guitars, driving rhythms and haunted melodies, alongside lyrics that explore more dark and macabre themes including fear, death and the supernatural. This may sound quite scary, spooky you might say, but I assure you it's not. Horror punk bands manage to eliminate any risk of actually scaring anybody through their oftentimes ridiculous dress code, which often combines the classic punk rock look with extremely low budget Halloween costumes. Horror punk started in the late 70s with bands like The Damned and The Cramps, adding more horror elements into their music and image. These bands would keep it semi-low-key though. Overdoing this could be extremely goofy, but of course it's punk, so somebody had to overdo it. The Misfits would also come to prominence in the late 70s, really pushing horror-themed lyrics to its limit, which essentially means singing about performing extremely over-the-top Scooby-Doo level crimes in many of the songs. This lyricism would be combined with their image. They straight up walked on stage looking like this, Although goofy, Misfits have become incredibly iconic, with their logo probably being one of the most common tattoos for midlife crisis boomers. Another one with an extremely silly name would be egg punk, which is the most recent genre to emerge that I've discussed so far. It's also the most confusing, with most of my research including contradicting statements about whether this genre actually exists or not. Luckily it has a funny name, so it deserves a place on the Coolia channel. Egg punk is essentially a rebellion against the hardcore serious approach to music taken by many bands within the chain punk genre, which is essentially a more traditional and violent approach to punk. Egg punk is more satirical, energetic and danceable than much of the more serious styles of punk they aim to make fun of, often utilising brighter synths and extremely cheap recording equipment. Essentially, if chain punk epitomises this person, egg punk is more akin to this person. Bands include Devo, GT and Satanic Togas. This is where we get to the point where a lot of these subgenres become extremely inconsistent and in many ways similar to each other, with small and extremely specific things differentiating them. So I think it's time for a bit of a speed run to get through some of the more interesting ones. Anarcho-punk encapsulates all forms of punk rock that encourage anarchism, with the term often being applied to many of the bands coming out of the UK in the 70s and 80s. Obviously this term was directly inspired by the Sex Pistols, however other bands include Crass and Icons of Filth. This genre has mainly petered out in the modern day, because anarchists today look like this and post about anarchy on their £2,000 Apple computer, so it's kind of lost its edge a little bit. Art punk is essentially post-punk, except everyone is a lot more pretentious. It's essentially punk that takes a more experimental approach, often appealing to people outside of this demographic. Bands include Refused and Brand New. Aside from being a term that correctly describes these kind of people, crust punk is also a subgenre. Crust punk, also known as stenchcore, is a style of punk that includes dark and pessimistic lyricism that often focus on more political and social issues. Sonically, crust incorporates bassy and dirty guitar tones, extremely fast tempos, and vocals that sound more like this than this. Oi is the first subgenre in this video that doesn't include the word punk, but to be fair, if I had to think of the most punk sounding word, it probably would be oi. Oi would be a direct response to the commercialisation of punk, resulting in a culture of working class youths rejecting bands trying to overcomplicate or pump more money into the genre. Although oi is mainly seen as a skinhead genre, it originally was meant to bring skinheads, punks and other subcultures together, which obviously didn't work because of our tribal instincts. Oi combines the early punk sound with football chants, The Who, and anything else that is considered overly British. Punk pathétique, also known as fun punk, is another subgenre that focuses on pointing more fun at the punk formula, adding humour to the mix, although this came to fruition long before egg punk. Bands include The Shapes and The Not Sensibles. Taqwacore is a scene of punk that mainly includes young Muslims living within Western countries who reject traditionalist interpretations of Islam, with it basically being a split of who continues to accept the religion and who decides to live their life outside of Islam. The word taqwa translates to piety or quality of being God-fearing. Troll punk is a subgenre developed in Sweden, which often involves extremely fast drumming, a melodic sound, and politically charged lyrics, which to me just sounds like punk as a whole, but I'm sure they're doing some weird. It seems every time a Scandinavian picks up an electric guitar, it always leads to some weird. Celtic punk is the fusion of punk with influences and instrumentation from traditional Celtic music. This includes the use of bagpipes, fiddle, tin whistle, accordion, mandolin and banjo. Oftentimes bands within the subgenre will play covers of traditional Celtic music in the stylings of punk. Examples include the Flogging Mollies and Dropkick Murphys. Scottish Gaelic punk is a subgenre that actually fits within the Celtic punk subgenre, because of course it does. The majority of bands within the subgenre sing all their music in the language Scottish Gaelic. Many of these bands are also anarchists and environmentalists, because once again, of course they are. And finally, the weirdest subgenre of them all, one so strange I had to leave it to the very end. Something that truly takes punk and pushes it to its absolute limits. Melodic punk. Punk that features melodic and upbeat elements. Truly otherworldly.